Hey, what's going on? Jay again. And this is a clip that really caught my attention. I thought it was really good because it's real. And so in my travels, I've seen it. I've seen how in different instances, especially like when you go to different parts of Africa, I would see this thing kind of happen. So I'm gonna show you the clip and then I'm gonna offer some of my thoughts. And then of course, I want you to chime in as well.
Woman.
My daughter's mom is American. Most African parents, if we're being honest, they would actually prefer you bring home a white person. It's messed up because like we talk about Uncle Tom's and racism and what it did to African Americans, but colonialism did a number on Africans. So a lot of Africans, they default to thinking white people are
Superior.
So it's more
It goes from white people to Asian, Hispanic, and then black. America's number one export is entertainment. A lot of Africans know our culture as far as our food and our clothes and things like that, but we don't necessarily know the context. So we don't consider y'all's context. So we don't think about Jim Crow, or we don't think about, post-traumatic slavery. We don't think about that stuff. So we just look at it kind of like how Asian people look at it. Why are those niggas acting the way that they do? Even though we have a kind of similar story, we don't make that same connection that, oh, this happened to them, then this happened to them, then this happened to them, and it's still happening. So that's why we have that same kind of mindset.
I've heard that many times, especially the divide. And I think that's when it's like not understanding each other's story, or one person thinks their story is better than the other person's story, or another person feels their story is worse. I don't understand how them lazy African Americans, they have all these opportunities and they're just over there just throwing it away. They're all lazy. They're all this, that, and the other. Or I've heard the whole argument about, those Africans coming over and they're trying to say they're African American and they're stealing all of the opportunities from those who were actually fighting and made it to where they could even have the opportunities, and they're not respecting it. So I've seen both sides of it. And what it really boils down to is not understanding each other's story. So one, and this is what I had to educate a lot of my brothers and sisters on, is they go to Africa, especially when we take them to see, they're like, well, how come they don't know our story? How come they don't know our history? Well, we barely know our history, truth be told. So we know what they told us in the history books and what we saw on TV, and maybe what some of our grandparents may or may not have told us, because I'm just getting mine to start talking, my elders to start talking about what was going on, because it just wasn't a part of our family culture to talk about those things. Sometimes the traumas that occurred brought about silence, and that's why I saw a lot of alcoholism, a lot of abuse, a lot of dysfunction within my personal family, because folks didn't talk about what was happening. But with that said, a lot of people over and they said, well, how come they don't know about our history? Or when they would go to some of the different dungeons, many of the people in the local area kind of acted indifferent, like, okay, it's just another building. And a lot of folks coming from the U.S. or different parts of the African diaspora, they would get offended. They would say, well, don't you understand what happened here? The reality is most of them didn't, because they might have gotten a little something in the history books here and there, but to really understand the gravity and the depths of what occurred in those spaces, the majority didn't know. But I threw it back. I said, but do you know their story? Do you know what they went through on the continent? Well, no, they sold us into slavery. And so they've been living in a lap of luxury ever since. And that's when I understood the depths of misinformation, the depths of ignorance, the depths of intentional separation and knowledge separation and all of that from both sides. Because if you're thinking that what happened on the continent of Africa was like people rode off into the sunset and just lived their best lives without understanding how many resistances occurred and how many, as they would call it, rebellions occurred in Namibia, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria, all throughout the entire continent, even before they were countries, people who were resisting and who were enslaved, because there were concentration camps in South Africa and in Kenya, and I'm sure many other places, that the colonizers, the Europeans, had put in place. But then you also had plantations that were occurring on the continent. There were homes that were destroyed. There were families and villages that were destroyed as a result of what was going on during that time. And so whenever I hear someone, that rhetoric and that conversation, it's like, wow, this is speaking to the power of the colonial education system that's been put in place in the U.S., as well as most parts of Africa. You know, the French control the Francophone educational systems, and the British control the Anglophone educational systems. And whatever colonizer had a particular territory and created that country, hear what I said, whichever colonizer controlled that territory and whichever colonizer created that country also created the educational system and created the economy by which people were forced to conform and to fit into. So even though there's all these constitutions and they have these black names and faces and everything on it, the reality is the powers that still to this day control these countries are colonial or imperial interests. So if they're not colonial interests, they're imperial interests. So then it goes back to that whole thing about, well, why do you see this white worship in so many parts of Africa? Because that's the conditioning. I mean, you go to many of these places and the judges and lawyers and everything are still wearing the white wigs, you know, the British wigs and all for the judicial. So that's a real thing, you know. But of course, you know, when you get brown bodies that don't see a problem with it, then you're going to have this particular affection towards the very systems and the very people who are designed to keep you in your place. And that's why many of these countries suffer. That's why we flip it over to the US, why many black communities suffer, because we put these puppet politicians in place who, if they could wear the white wig, they would. You know, that's just not a part of the American culture, but their mindset flows the same way. So you'll even see black folks in America who are sitting up here wishing that they could be white. If they could turn in their brown skin, they would turn it in a heartbeat, because that's just how they roll. That's the mentality that they have. That's what they've been raised under. And that's why it's so important, one, to travel, because then you get a chance to see the broader context. Two, it's important for us to educate ourselves and to understand, where did these educational systems come from? Who created these textbooks? Who created these curriculums? Who holds the standard on intelligence? How does this work? What is the psychology behind this particular classroom structure? And why is it that, you know, we try to put everybody in these square pegs in these round holes and then judge their intelligence based upon these systems that someone else created in a laboratory probably, or some sort of, you know, someplace they decide this is how we want it to be. It's when we break out of that and we start learning for ourselves that we can truly start liberating our own minds. And then we can start seeing the world objectively, because now when I hear it, I understand what happened. The good part is now, as more and more people are traveling and starting to learn for themselves, they're able to go back and tell a different story. And even in many of these countries on the continent of Africa, there are people who are intentionally saying, here's the broader story. Here's what happened here on the continent. Here's what happened in the US. Here's what happened in the UK. Here's what happened in Jamaica, in Brazil, in Canada. And more people are taking their own education into their own hands. And as a result, they're elevating themselves as a people. So those are my thoughts. You know, hey, you could dive into that. What are some of your thoughts on that whole breakdown about the white worship on the continent of Africa when it comes to, you know, for some others, hey, guess what? More and more people are waking up. All right, more on the way. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share as we continue to talk about the soul of the African diaspora. Adventures of Darren and Destiny. And Darren and Destiny are twin brother and sister, and you go on their adventures throughout the African diaspora, meaning so African diaspora destinations, primarily focused in Africa, but we go to South America, we're going to go to the Caribbean. Their first book is going to take you to Ghana, and then we're going to go on a safari, and from there we're going to go to Ethiopia, and then we go to Salvador, Brazil. And what the goal is to be able to inspire curiosity in the continent of Africa, in our children from a very young age, and to really tell a more accurate story. Most of our children are exposed to negative images, late night infomercials about how bad things are, everybody's sick, everybody's poor, everyone's uneducated, but that's simply not true. So what Darren and Destiny and their family do is they go to different African destinations. They are learning about these different places. You're beginning to see positive images, but still telling the truth. I mean, that's the important thing, to tell the truth about some of the things that have occurred. But it's all done on a children's level so they begin to understand it. And it begins to pique their curiosity. They begin to learn more. And hopefully one day they will want to explore and visit the continent of Africa and its many countries. There's just so much that Darren and Destiny are able to do, and as they're doing it, it's like they begin to open the minds of a new generation, and they don't get bombarded and indoctrinated with negativity. They're actually able to see positivity and inspiring images and messages about the African diaspora, as well as those who are still indigenous to the continent of Africa, and they begin to learn more and just see things differently. So I'm excited about introducing the adventures of Darren and Destiny.